Today we're taking a look at F1 2022 from Codemasters, the official video game of the 2022 Formula 1 World Championship. And we're testing 38 GPUs on it, so there's lots to go through. Now, I'm sure I don't need to tell you too much about the F1 series of games, considering it's been going strong in a variety of ways from its inception with F1 2000 back in the year 2000 from EA Sports, until Codemasters managed to grab the license in 2008 and release their first game in the series with F1 2009. I guess you could now say that things have turned full circle, considering Codemasters were purchased by EA in 2021 for a staggering $1.2 billion. So that brings us to today, an F1 22, which has been released on EA's very own Origin platform, along with the EA desktop app, Epic Game Store, and the version I have here today on Steam. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits from my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32 gig of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits, or if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver, thanks, but where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. And you call me the stupid one. Now, while there's been a lot of new features added, including updated physics, new car models and updated tracks, on the technical side, things get really interesting now with support for virtual reality on PC, including the Oculus Rift and HTC Vive. I've not tried it yet, but I'm pretty sure it's going to make me sick. The official release for the game also coincided with the British Grand Prix on Sunday the 3rd of July, which, if anyone watched, was one of the craziest races I've ever seen, and we hope that everyone involved in the crash is recovering well. Now, with the fact that the F1 series of games have been out for so long, I want to kind of focus more on graphics card performance than delving into the game itself and doing any kind of review. So much like its predecessors, F1 22 is still using the Ego 4.0 engine, which we've seen before, and it's always given us stunning visuals and fluid gameplay, so I am expecting more of the same with F1 22. So within F1 2022, it does have a benchmark mode from within the graphics settings, but to simulate what's representative of what you're actually getting game in real world performance, we jumped into a time trial and took a drive. Now, due to the fact that we're looking at GPU performance only, this kind of test was fine for what we're trying to achieve and allowed us to keep things as consistent as possible. If we'd have jumped into a full-on race, the variables just would have been so different on each and every run that it wouldn't have really been deemed as a fair test. To appeal to the largest audience, we tested the game at 3 different resolutions on both the medium and ultra high presets with ray tracing disabled, and then also for the cards that supported it, we tested again on the ultra high preset but with ray tracing enabled to see how the game's performance was for that. In total, we tested 38 cards with a mixture between AMD and Nvidia, and are including results for the Nvidia 10, 16, 20 and 30 series cards, while on AMD we're including the 6000 series only. And this is based solely on the Steam hardware survey, which clearly shows a strong dominance in favour of Nvidia, and the fact that I thought 38 GPUs was enough, considering the time it took us to test every single one of them. In terms of the testing components, we ran the game on our X570 based test bench with our Ryzen 9 5900X on an Asus Crosshair 8 Dark Hero motherboard. We used 32 gig of Corsair Dominator Platinum RGB, 3600 MHz dual channel memory, and due to the amount of cards we tested and not all of them supporting it, we disabled resizable bar and smart access memory for all cards that supported it. As always, we'll be putting all of our charts and testing data onto Patreon, so if you want to see it all there, as well as get a ton of other benefits, then the link is down below. Without further ado, let's get into it. So starting with 1080p on the medium setting and taking a look at some of the different cards we tested. Straight away we see the 6900 XT and 6950 XT both at the very top of our charts, storming ahead of the RTX 3090 Ti. Now, generally speaking, Codemaster games, including the F1 series and Dirt series, have always been I guess, favoured towards AMD, so that's no real major surprise here. What is interesting to see though is that cards like the 6750 XT just pushing ahead of the high-end 30 series cards, albeit only by a few frames and representing slightly lower results when looking at the 1% lows. The RTX 2080 Ti still shows that it's able to keep up with the big guns, seeing very similar results to the 3080 Ti and 3090. I guess there's still some life in the old girl yet. As we move further down, we're still getting some crazy numbers on the mid-range cards, seeing cards like the 6600 XT at over 300 frames per second. As we move towards some slightly older 20 series cards, we still have some great frame rates of over 250 FPS from cards like the RTX 2060 Super. The 16 series cards still gave us respectable results, with cards like the GTX 1660 showing performance of 173 frames per second. And lastly, as we move down to the very end, even the newest RX 6400 and almost relic GTX 1050 were pushing above that magical 60 FPS number that everyone craves. As we move up to 1440p, we see a few results move around, with the RX 6950 XT taking the top spot, followed closely by its little brother, the 6900 XT. The RTX 3090 Ti has managed to move up slightly, showing that it can keep up at the higher resolution. And as we move down to the mid-range, we still see a few 20 series cards scattered around at over 200 FPS, and even the trusty old 1080 Ti at 203 frames per second. If you're still rocking an older 16 series card, we see the likes of the 1650 Super at 115 frames per second, showing some really fluid gameplay and some very respectable numbers. If you're limited on budget or rocking something older like a GTX 1050 or the recently released GTX 1630, then fear not. While the numbers don't exactly look great at around 50 FPS, the game still ran extremely well, and we found anything above 30 FPS didn't really show any noticeable lag. Moving on to 4K, we see that the highest end Nvidia cards have gained a decent bump in performance over the RX 6900 XT. The increase in performance was still not enough to dethrone the 6950 XT though, and resulted in it tying with the RTX 3090 Ti for the top spot, though the 6950 XT did have a slightly higher figure when looking at the 1% lows. Also at 4K, last generation's Nvidia cards still fared well and managed to stay above 60 FPS, with some of them even still managing to pull well above 100 FPS. Some of the older cards were also managing to prove their worth by pulling off some very respectable frame rates even at 4K. And once again we can see that the good old 1080 Ti is able to punch above its weight by getting just over 100 frames per second. Our first signs of trouble started appearing among the lower end cards, with the first time that we've seen frame rates below 30 FPS. The GTX 1050, 1050 Ti and even the brand new GTX 1630 all dropped below 30 FPS, with the 1050 being a particularly bad example. This was the first time we experienced the frame rate of the game getting in the way of actual playability, as the responsiveness made it suddenly very difficult to actually drive, especially around the bends. When we changed the graphics settings to the ultra high preset, we noticed a very large drop in performance for the higher end cards, with the very top result in 1080p ending up losing over 100 frames per second, compared to the performance that we saw at medium. That being said, we still see the 6950 XT edging ahead of the much more expensive 3090 Ti by around 22 frames per second. The mid-tier cards still managed to get frame rates well over 100 FPS at ultra high, whilst the lowest tier cards were a bit of a mixed bag and started to drop off when looking at the GTX 1650 and lower. Some of them lowest tier cards ended up with performance still managing to get above 60 FPS, but a couple of these cards fell slightly below that. The 1050 again in particular barely managed to get a score higher than 30 FPS. At 1440p, the 6950 XT has finally seen its fall from grace, and the 3090 Ti has now managed to pull ahead by a whole whopping 1 frame per second. General performance among the high end was all very similar, everything stayed above 200 FPS, until we saw a sudden dip from the RX 6800. The mid and even low end saw perfectly playable frame rates, with the majority of the cards staying above 60 FPS, and the unsung hero returns, the 1080 Ti, which was still managing to pull off performance that rivaled some of the newer cards on offer, only making a noticeable difference when we look at the 1% lows, which is where you'll feel most of the performance drops when in game. Before moving on to the final load of tests, we need to have a look at the performance of the game in 4K. For the most part, the trend of perfectly respectable and playable frame rates continues. Even most of the 16 series of cards managed to achieve well above 30 FPS, which is still perfectly playable for most people, especially for those who are maybe used to console gaming. But good things don't last, and when we take a look at the performance on the low end of the spectrum, we see results that made it feel more like being tortured rather than playing a game. The lowest cards in the 10 and 6000 series of GPUs left much to be desired. The 1050 again was a particularly bad showing, not even managing 10 frames per second. This was by far the worst experience we saw, or at least it would be, but the RX 6400 refused to run at all. Trying to run the game at these settings on that card caused the game to hard crash every time we changed the resolution. And if it maintained the 4K resolution when we booted the game back up, loading into the pre-race screen would then cause another instant crash. But in all honesty, who's buying a card like that and expecting to play at 4K anyway? Okay, so ray tracing then. This game offers pretty much all the ray tracing you could want. But when it comes to having to sacrifice frame rates for some pretty lighting, is it actually worth it? Well, at 1080p, the performance of the cards all remained at what we consider to be playable, with the most surprising performance coming out of the RTX 2080 Ti, which saw an identical average FPS to the newer RTX 3070. I guess the extra memory on the 2080 Ti more than makes up for it. We can also see just how much better Nvidia are at ray tracing when compared to AMD, with the top 5 cards being all from Nvidia, and beating out what proved to be one of the best cards on the market multiple times, the RX 6950 XT. If you've been following us for a while now, this may come as no surprise to you, but what might be a shock is how the RTX 3050 fell 11 FPS behind the RX 6650 XT, whose 1% low FPS was still higher than the average of the 3050. 1440p was much of the same thing, but with slightly lower frame rates, but none of the cards came to a point of unplayableness. Everything had an average above 30 FPS, and that proved to still be high enough that the game was perfectly playable. For most people, I would imagine that getting frame rates above 60 at these settings would be more than they could wish for, and in order to get that kind of performance, you don't even need to have the be-all and end-all graphics card, as we saw here. 4K is a slightly different story. More pixels means more work for the GPU, and here we start to see even the most powerful cards start to struggle. Not even the 3090 Ti managed to average above 60 FPS here, just barely falling behind. Of the grand total of 11 cards that managed to stay above 30 FPS, only 3 of them were AMD. And whilst we did test more Nvidia than AMD in our testing, this was for the simple fact of AMD's lack of ray tracing support on older cards. And even on the new cards that do support it, we didn't want to put the poor things through too much. Everything below the 30 FPS point was only just playable, but the cards that went below 20 FPS were the cards that are just miserable to play on, with a special mention to the RTX 3050 that crashed twice trying to change the resolution before it finally stuck and let us test it. Again, you're not likely to buy that kind of card and play at these settings on this resolution, but still something worth mentioning. So hopefully looking at the charts, you can potentially see the card you already have or the card you're looking at getting in there. And that gives you some kind of indication as to how things are going to run on your system at the very same settings. Now, one thing I do want to touch on is in terms of the quality. Obviously, we ran our tests at 3 different quality presets at 3 different resolutions. But the interesting thing about the quality presets is between medium and ultra high, the quality, especially at higher resolutions, just wasn't as noticeable as I anticipated. Then, even moving beyond to enabling ray tracing on the ultra high preset, you could definitely see a difference, but nothing on the same scale as we've seen in other titles. Though playing devil's advocate here, it's such a fast-paced game that the likes of ray tracing, while it's a nice to have feature, it's not a visual setting that you really, I guess, get the chance to take in because you're too focused on moving around the track as fast as you physically can. I guess it's fair to say that if you aren't using a super high-end card and have the choice of having better quality graphics or higher frame rates, I think medium may be the way to go for you, or something in between. That's really going to get you that balance of great looking visuals while keeping the frame rate high. Also, given the choice, I think it's safe to say that prioritizing resolution over quality is definitely more important here, and I think you'll appreciate it just a little bit more. Obviously, when it comes to racing at night, things are a little bit different, mainly going between the medium and ultra high preset. If anything, medium looks a bit foggy in the distance, and changing up to ultra high, whether it's with ray tracing or not, just seems to add a bit more contrast in the darker areas. But with ray tracing, it just doesn't seem to give us much more over the same setting as without it. A little bit of a disappointment, but still looking pretty nice overall. Now, one thing I noticed in our testing is that this game is extremely well optimized for all types of hardware, whether it be new or old. For instance, even a low-end card like the RX 6400, this little guy here at medium settings at 1080p was still getting 121 frames per second. Even bumping it up to the ultra high preset saw the FPS drop, but still sit at a fully respectable 62 FPS. Now, when it comes to other resolutions, we did have to concede that cards like the 6400, while it did run at 1440p, 4K was just out of the question. In terms of our lowest end Nvidia RTX card, the 3050, we saw some interesting results on the ultra high preset with ray tracing enabled. Now, most gamers would quiver at the thought of 48 FPS, but the game was still more than playable, only seeing a 41 FPS 1% low, and we found that all of the cards that sat above 30 FPS were fully playable and super smooth. It was only when it dropped below that it just felt a little bit laggy. That's probably the best way I can explain it. What I'm trying to say is that even low-end hardware shouldn't have an issue playing F122. And even older hardware like the super popular GTX 1060 6GB, which did 145 frames per second at 1080p on medium and 94 FPS at ultra high at 1080p. So if you are rocking one of them older generation cards, fear not, the game should run fluidly for you and look pretty damn decent at the same time. So there you have it. As I mentioned, we will be putting all of our testing data and charts onto Patreon, so definitely check that out, especially if you appreciate the huge amount of testing and effort that went into this. It was almost a full week of repetitive testing, and me and the team are frankly glad it's over, until the next game comes out and we do it all over again. But like I mentioned, everything's on Patreon and you get a whole host of other goodies as well, so definitely check it out. For now, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, like and a sub to the channel would be absolutely amazing. And I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.